Welcome to this week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. I'm John Strum, and I'm the host of the Real Talk MS podcast. Each week, Real Talk MS reaches thousands of people in more than 90 countries around the world with the news that people affected by MS need to know. I'm also a non-scientist member of the International Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee. I'm a district activist leader for the National MS Society, and I chair the Society's California Government Relations Advisory Committee. My wife, Jean, lived with progressive MS for 23 years, so I've had a front row seat experiencing all the ways that MS can impact a family. I'm thrilled to be with you today. I see people are continuing to join our webcast, so let's give them another few seconds, and then we'll get started. Thank you to all of you who are joining us on GoToWebinar, Facebook Live, and YouTube Live. The MS Society's Ask an MS Expert webcast is designed to connect you with MS experts who are ready to answer your questions on the topics that impact people affected by MS every day. So as I chat with our expert today, please feel free to post your questions on Facebook and YouTube or type them into the question box if you're joining us on GoToWebinar. We'll try to answer as many of your questions as we can during the Q&A portion of today's program. For people with MS, getting vaccinated to prevent infections is an important part of their overall medical care. Yet many people living with multiple sclerosis have concerns about the safety of routine vaccinations, and looking ahead to the discovery and eventual availability of a COVID-19 vaccine, well, even more questions are being raised. Today, we're talking with neurologist and clinical fellow, Dr. John Ciotti from Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. Dr. Ciotti has just published a complete overview of the scientific literature about how MS disease-modifying therapies affect the way people with MS respond to vaccinations. Welcome, Dr. Ciotti, and thanks for joining us today. The COVID-19 pandemic has created a public health crisis that really underscores the importance of infection control and prevention. Vaccines play a key role in reducing the spread of disease and even preventing disease. But with so many different vaccines and whatever special considerations might exist for each, it's tough for someone who's living with MS to know what to do and when to do it. So let's talk about what people should know about vaccines, especially in light of COVID-19. Dr. Ciotti, I'm hoping you can get us started by explaining how vaccines protect us from diseases and viruses.
Well, thank you, John. It's great to be here. Good to talk to you today. And I really appreciate you and the National MS Society putting on webinars like this, especially addressing a topic that's so important and particularly relevant nowadays. So to get at the question, really developing that basic background understanding of what the purpose of a vaccine is and how they work. The goal of these vaccines is to really train the immune system to recognize a particular pathogen, whether that's a bacteria or a virus, so that the immune system is ready to respond if it's exposed again to this virus or bacteria in the environment at some point in the future. Vaccines have been really important and effective in eliminating scourges like polio going back decades to the 1950s. And even more recently, we were able to develop an Ebola vaccine. All of us are a little bit more familiar with the vaccines that we get a bit more annually, like the seasonal influenza shot. All of these vaccines work by exposing the individual to the pathogen, so a virus or a bacteria, in a way that won't actually make them sick. And in doing so, the immune system develops memory. So they're able to recognize this particular pathogen as something that's foreign so that it's ready to attack it again if they become infected. There are a lot of different ways to do this and many different types of vaccines, a lot of different ways to expose someone so that they won't get sick.
Well, I'm going to ask you for one more explanation or clarification about the different types of vaccines. So I'm hoping you'll help us understand the difference between a live attenuated vaccine and an inactivated vaccine.
Yeah, so that's an important distinction to make, especially for people living with MS. So an inactivated vaccine is a type of vaccine where you have the entire pathogen, so a bacteria or a virus, that's been killed in some way. So it can be with chemicals, heat, radiation. A couple of examples of these types of vaccines are the seasonal influenza vaccine, the one that's injected, as well as the polio vaccine. These types of vaccines are very safe because there is no live virus that's present. And you can contrast that a little bit with the live attenuated vaccines, as you mentioned. Some examples of these vaccines are things like the varicella vaccine, as well as the nasal seasonal influenza vaccine. These vaccines use the entire pathogen, so it is a live virus, but it has been weakened in some way in the laboratory. Because patients get exposed to this live virus, these vaccines are very effective. They induce really strong immune responses, and you develop some long-lasting immune memory with just 1 or 2 doses. So there certainly are some advantages to these live attenuated viruses. There just needs to be some caution in those that have weakened immune systems, and I'm sure we'll get into that.
I think we're about to. We've already heard from Emily, who's asking if there are vaccines she should always receive and vaccines perhaps that she should never receive. So what are the special considerations that people living with MS should understand in deciding which vaccines are best for them?
Yeah. So first and foremost, preventing infections through and preventable infections through the use of these vaccines is a really key part of medical care for people living with MS. The infections that these vaccines prevent can certainly lead to significant complications for people living with MS, especially those that have more severe disability. So in general, it's recommended that people with MS receive vaccines according to the standard vaccine schedule. To get a little bit more specific here, unless there's really a specific reason not to, such as an allergy or a prior severe allergic reaction, you should really be getting the seasonal influenza vaccine every year. And that's going to be especially important this year with the coronavirus pandemic. There are exceptions to some of these rules. So people who are experiencing a serious relapse of their MS, something that really affects their ability to kind of carry out their activities of daily life, should probably defer vaccinating until 4 to 6 weeks after the onset of that relapse. Some of the medicines that we use to treat relapses, in particular corticosteroids, they may lower the effectiveness of the vaccine that you would be getting as well. Again, there are certain distinctions to make when thinking about which vaccines are recommended and which ones we have to be a little bit more careful with. The inactivated vaccines, those things like the seasonal influenza vaccine, generally considered safe for people living with MS. But there are some concerns about the use of live attenuated vaccines in those who are on immunosuppressive disease-modifying therapies. Generally, these live attenuated viruses can be recognized, they can be fended off in those who have an intact immune system. But if the immune system is suppressed, your body can react in such a way that this live attenuated virus actually causes you to become infected. So generally, this type of vaccine should be given before starting an immunosuppressive medication. And if you're not sure, it's always a good idea to talk with your neurologist, talk with your doctor about which vaccines are safe for you to receive.
Well, I'm glad you brought up MS disease-modifying therapies, because we've already received several questions from people who are watching, and they're asking whether MS disease-modifying therapies themselves can lower the effectiveness of vaccines. Can you tell us about the article you recently published and what we know about the effects of MS disease-modifying therapies on responses to vaccinations?
So we looked back at some of the studies that have been done in people living with MS on immune responses to vaccines. So how well a vaccine has trained the immune system to respond to that pathogen. And we looked at vaccines of different types, so live attenuated, inactivated, as well as other types of vaccines. And we looked at how things broke down based on what disease-modifying therapy patients were on. So just to kind of go through the laundry list here, There have been several studies that have demonstrated that immune responses are preserved in people with MS who are being treated with beta interferons. So these drugs like Avonex, Rebif, beta-seron. We think that that's pretty solid evidence. We've seen studies with multiple vaccine types, so live attenuated as well as inactivated viruses, and it looks like those on beta-ferons will have preserved immune responses. In looking at medications like Tecfidera, it looks like those folks will have preserved vaccine responses as well, although the data is a little bit more limited. To varying degrees, vaccine responses are a little bit reduced in those who are treated with drugs like Copaxone, Aubagio, Gilenya, Mayzent, and Tysabri. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that the vaccines were ineffective. The majority of these studies actually showed that the immune responses still reached protective levels, but the response was just a little bit blunted in comparison to those who weren't on a DMT. There's another aspect of this. There's thinking about the timing of these vaccinations. So with medications like Lemtrada, as well as some of the S1P modulators, so things like Gilenya and Mayzent, it looks like timing may play a role. And then Ocuvis as well. So Ocuvis works by targeting the B cells, which are extremely important in terms of responding to not just infections, but also vaccines. And so perhaps as expected, there was a very good study that was done a couple of years ago looking at immune responses to vaccines in folks on Ocuvis that did show that those vaccine responses were significantly impaired. Now, there's other medicines, the new ones, so things like Mavenclad, as well as the high doses of steroids that we use, where data is a little bit more lacking. And the data is certainly not complete. It's only looking really at one aspect of immune responses to vaccines. So there's certainly room for improvement in the data that we have, but as of now, that's kind of the breakdown.
Some folks are also asking whether the use of vaccines can cause MS flares to either happen or to get worse.
So this is a question that I get asked all the time. At this point, there's really not evidence to show that vaccine use causes MS flares to either occur or get worse. Again, the evidence is a little bit limited, and so we generally recommend that if you're having a flare to, again, consider waiting until it's passed to receive that vaccine.
And this is a related question, I guess, but do medications that might be used to treat an MS flare lessen a vaccine's effectiveness?
They may. So here's another area where the data is somewhat limited. So primarily the treatment of flares of multiple sclerosis is with corticosteroids. There have been several studies in non-MS populations that have shown that corticosteroids have maybe a minimal impact on vaccine responses, but there's a really big caveat there. And that caveat is that the doses of corticosteroids that were used in those earlier studies are not exactly the same as the very high doses that we sometimes use to treat an MS relapse. So just based on how they work, we suspect that those really high doses may lessen how effective a vaccine is.
Is there any evidence that certain vaccines are likely to increase the risk of developing MS for anyone?
John, I'm glad you asked that question because it's a question that we get all the time, and the answer is no. We do not have evidence that a particular vaccine is likely to increase the risk of developing MS, but this was a topic that was frankly debated for quite some time, even stretching into the 1990s, the 2000s. We've had several vaccines that have been implicated or associated with the development of MS. One of those vaccines in particular, the hepatitis B vaccine, the debate was very fierce. And there was actually a drop in hepatitis B vaccine compliance after that initial association was made. But all of these were just associations. They did not show causality. And all of these initial associations have subsequently been disproven. They've been refuted, and what we can say now is that no vaccine is linked in the development or worsening of MS.
Well, thank you for clarifying what I know are issues that confuse so many people. Thank you for helping us better understand the interaction between vaccines and disease-modifying therapies. Before we talk more specifically about what people need to know about vaccines and COVID-19 and the coming flu season, I want to take a quick moment to welcome those of you who've continued to join us on GoToWebinar, Facebook Live, and YouTube Live. Please let us know what's on your mind. Post your comments and questions on Facebook and YouTube, or type them into the questions box if you joined us on GoToWebinar. Our Ask an MS Expert live event takes place at this same time every Friday. So please help us make sure that everyone knows about it by sharing news about the webcast with your family and your friends. We've been talking with neurologist and clinical fellow Dr. John Ciotti from Washington University about the interactions between MS disease-modifying therapies and vaccines. Now I'd like to change gears just a little. The CDC has told us that efforts to reduce the spread of COVID-19, such as stay-at-home and shelter-in-place orders, have led to the decreased use of routine preventive medical services, including immunization services. Helping ensure that people continue to get their routine vaccinations during the pandemic is absolutely necessary if we're going to protect people and communities from vaccine preventable diseases and outbreaks. And since the flu season is right around the corner, this is an important conversation to have. Dr. Ciotti, what's the difference between influenza, the flu we either dread or realize it's coming around again every year? What's the difference between that flu and COVID-19?
So there are similarities and there are differences. So influenza is a virus, and so is SARS-CoV-2. That's the virus that causes COVID-19. But the structures of these viruses are different. That's why they belong to different families, or how we classify viruses. So influenza we think of as a orthomyxovirus, and SARS-CoV-2, of course, is a coronavirus. Some of the symptoms that you can see between flu and COVID-19 are similar. So things like fevers, chills, cough, shortness of breath, fatigue. It can be really hard and challenging to tell the difference between them based just on symptoms alone. So sometimes testing with some of these nasal swabs is really necessary to confirm a diagnosis. As we learn more about COVID-19 symptoms, though, we are starting to see some differentiating features of COVID-19. So things like loss of taste, loss of smell, those are generally not seen with influenza. They seem to be somewhat exclusive to COVID-19. Both of these viruses can spread from person to person between people who are in close contact with each other, so within 6 feet. They're mainly spread by droplets when people either cough, sneeze, talk. That's why wearing a mask is so important, because when these droplets get into the mouths and noses of others around you, that's really how the virus is transmitted. We also see that people even touching a surface or an object that has the virus on it, and then reaching up to touch your own mouth, nose, eyes in some way, that can also transmit the virus as well. We are seeing some super spreading events with COVID-19, where in one location it spreads to many different people. That's really serious and means that the virus can spread more quickly and easily to lots of people than influenza. And then, of course, one key differentiator between these two conditions is we have a vaccine for influenza, and we're still waiting on that one for SARS-CoV-2.
Well, that brings up a key question so many people living with MS tend to ask as we get into flu season. Should people living with MS get a flu shot?
So yes, the answer is yes, unless you have a very specific reason not to, like a prior allergic reaction to the flu vaccine. you should be receiving the flu vaccine every year. And this year in particular is quite important as we think about preventing viral spread. The injected flu vaccine, again, is inactivated, so generally felt to be safe in people living with MS, regardless of their DMT. The nasal flu vaccine, which again is not as recommended, is a live vaccine. And so those caveats that we talked about earlier about live vaccines and immunosuppressive disease modifying therapies, those caveats still apply.
We often hear that every year the flu vaccine is actually reformulated to target specific viruses. Which viruses will the flu vaccine protect against?
So the flu vaccine protects against the influenza virus, but there are a lot of different strains or variations of the influenza virus that can infect humans. So months ahead of time, scientists work to predict which strains are going to be most common in the community during that upcoming flu season, so that we can get a head start on producing the many millions of doses of flu vaccine that are needed for each flu season. The flu vaccine itself, the one that you get injected with every year, generally contains the 3 or 4 strains that scientists believe will be the most common during that season. So it is still possible to become infected with a different strain of influenza virus than the vaccine protects against, but getting this vaccine helps protect yourself against the most common strains that are circulating in the community, and overall can lower your chance of contracting influenza.
Jan wrote in saying that she's living with progressive MS, and she actually has 2 questions. She's wondering if she should get a flu vaccine earlier this year, even as early as this month, because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And Jan's also wondering if she can get the influenza vaccine and COVID-19. I'm sorry, I'm reading her question wrong. Can she get influenza and COVID-19 at the same time?
So Jan's asking some really great questions. Like we discussed, the flu vaccine targets a different virus than SARS-CoV-2. So just getting the flu vaccine in and of itself won't necessarily protect against COVID-19. One important point to remember is that the immune memory that a vaccine generates can fade a little bit over time. That's one reason why some vaccines are delivered with booster shots. So you're not just going in once, you're actually getting a couple of different doses. Getting the flu vaccine in August this month would really be a little bit too early, because that can actually leave you with a little bit of a reduced level of protection against influenza later during the peak of the flu season. I would say maybe September and October are better times to get vaccinated. Like we mentioned, influenza and SARS-CoV-2 are 2 different viruses. So to answer Jan's question, unfortunately, it is possible to test positive for both influenza and SARS-CoV-2 at the same time.
Tom is asking if COVID-19 is more dangerous than influenza.
So the answer to that is yes. There are a lot of different reasons for that. We've talked about some of the additional severe symptoms that can be seen with COVID-19, blood clots in the brain that can lead to strokes, abnormal impacts on the heart. So really serious side effects that we can see with COVID-19. We do have some known effective treatments that can address flu symptoms and sometimes shorten the duration of influenza. We're working on it, but getting closer to effective treatments of COVID-19, maybe not quite there yet. Also, again, COVID-19 appears to be several times more deadly than the flu, and even beyond just the mortality rate of SARS-CoV-2, patients with COVID-19 are more likely to require hospitalization. They're more likely to require ICU care than those who have complications of the flu. Again, we have that vaccine for influenza, but even without a vaccine, those who have been infected with a particular strain of the influenza virus may be immune to getting it again for a period of time. But because this virus, SARS-CoV-2, the cause of COVID-19, is a novel or new virus, no one has this natural immunity because they've had it before. And so there's just a larger proportion of the population that's at risk with this particular coronavirus.
Should an influenza vaccine be given to someone with suspected or confirmed COVID-19?
I would say no. I would say, regardless of whether or not you're living with MS, if you currently have COVID-19, your immune system, frankly, has more important priorities than generating that immune memory, that response to an influenza vaccine. I would recommend that vaccinations be postponed for people with suspected or confirmed COVID-19, regardless of whether or not you have symptoms. I think one really important consideration here is that if you have COVID-19, if you're actively infected, just going into the office for an influenza vaccine could potentially expose others. It could expose other patients in the office who may be at higher risk for comorbidities or infection. Could expose your doctor. And so those are important considerations to make when we talk about getting vaccines during an active infection.
Over the last several weeks, we've heard a lot of news about potential vaccines being developed and tested for COVID-19. What do we need to know about a COVID-19 vaccine?
So in general, vaccine development takes many years. Each new vaccine has to be rigorously tested, goes through multiple phases of clinical trials to prove at every step that it's safe and effective before being approved by the FDA. Each step in this process is very expensive. So if a vaccine fails at any stage of these clinical trials, it's really back to the drawing board. The development of a SARS-CoV-2 vaccine has been a little bit different. And I think that there's room for cautious optimism here. The first reason for that is just the sheer scale of the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine effort. This effort is completely unprecedented. Instead of testing just one vaccine at a time and walking it through these individual phases, I believe as of last week, there were 26 candidate vaccines that were already being evaluated in clinical trials around the world, and another 136 in preclinical evaluation, so not quite to the clinical trial stage yet. Those numbers that I just gave you are probably obsolete at this point. That's how rapidly the pace of vaccine development is moving. Just the fact that we're getting so many rolls of the dice here, I think there's actually a good chance that at least one of these vaccines passes all of its clinical trials. It's still too soon to predict which one or which ones will be successful or when that vaccine will ultimately be ready and distributed. But some companies and governments are already mass producing their vaccines so that if it's eventually shown to be safe and effective, we'll already have a head start on producing and distributing the vaccine to the population.
What are your thoughts about the safety of a COVID-19 vaccine for people living with MS?
So we've talked about some of the differences already between inactivated vaccine and a live virus vaccine. Some of the vaccine types in the SARS-CoV-2 phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials, those are the ones that are closest to being approved. They're largely inactivated virus vaccines, like we talked about. Some of them are subunit vaccines. These actually use just a small portion of the viral particle and uses that to stimulate the immune response. There's a newer type of vaccine that's also being tested in these later stage clinical trials called nucleic acid vaccines, where we're actually using the genetic code within the virus to stimulate an immune response. So some of these vaccine types have not been tested specifically in people with MS, but it doesn't mean that they will be necessarily unsafe. One thing to point out is that the live attenuated vaccines, like we were talking about earlier, those types of vaccines are actually not the ones that we're seeing in these later stage clinical trials right now.
Are there any special considerations like the timing of receiving a COVID-19 vaccine for those people who are taking a disease-modifying therapy?
So it's maybe, so the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine, because it's still a little bit early, it's hard to know what eventual type we're going to get. And the vaccine itself, when it comes out, will not have been tested explicitly in a population of patients just with multiple sclerosis. So what we're really doing from here is kind of speculating. We can use those prior scientific studies on the impact of disease-modifying therapies on the immune response to hypothesize how people living with MS on a particular DMT will respond to a variety of different types of vaccines, whatever ends up being developed. But at this point, it's a little bit too early to say whether or not any special considerations would need to be made for people living with MS.
Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Ciotti, for sharing your expertise on a topic that I know there's just a tremendous amount of curiosity about and interest in. Now I'd like to focus our time on addressing some of the questions that our audience has for you. And we have a question from Regina, who wrote in saying that she heard that the virus that causes COVID-19 is mutating. What does that mean? And does this change the ability of any vaccine in development to really be effective?
Yeah, so just to backtrack a little bit here. So a mutation in a virus is really a small error or a change in the genetic coding of the virus itself. Mutations generally occur randomly throughout the viral genome. So if you were to imagine the viral genome as the alphabet with all of the letters in the correct sequence, so A, B, C, all the way up through X, Y, Z, a mutation can be something like the B drops out, you have A, C, D. Can be something like switching a couple of the letters. So instead of X, Y, Z, you have Y, X, Z. A lot of times these mutations don't really have an impact on what we can observe about the virus. So how the virus is structured, how severe the disease it causes, how treatable it is, how transmissible it is, or how contagious it is, or how easy it can replicate and pass along to another generation. And that's the really critical point there. If a virus has mutated in such a way that that it's easier to pass along to another generation, then over time that new strain can become more prevalent. We've actually seen this with SARS-CoV-2. So this mutated in a similar way in Europe back in February. And now that new strain that popped up then, it appears to be more infectious than the original strain. And that new strain that emerged in Europe is now the dominant strain throughout the world. So infectiousness does not equal severity of disease. This new strain doesn't look like it causes more severe disease than the original strain did. All viruses mutate at a certain rate. If a virus mutates more quickly, the higher the likelihood that it would develop one of these more serious mutations. But fortunately, the SARS-CoV-2 virus does not look like it's mutating very quickly. The mutation that occurred back in February affected the spike protein. I think on the last slide, you had the nice picture that we see in the media of a ball with all of these red spikes around it. And this particular coronavirus, see right there, this particular coronavirus uses that spike protein as the key going into the lock. That's how it gains access to cells. And a lot of the vaccines that are currently in development target the spike protein. The mutation that impacted the spike was a little bit different than the area, the part of the spike that these vaccines in development are targeting. So really, to answer Regina's question, as of now, it doesn't look like the viral mutations that have occurred already are going to impact an eventual vaccine's effectiveness. And based on the relatively low mutation rate of the virus, and again, just the sheer number of vaccines that are being studied, I wouldn't expect our vaccine development to be significantly impacted by one of these mutations.
Sandra wants to know, what possible side effects can she expect from a COVID-19 vaccine?
Good question. I can't say that we know this definitively yet, just because we don't know what this vaccine will ultimately look like. There have been some of the phase 1 safety studies from some of the vaccines that you've heard about in the media. What we've seen and what we know from those studies so far is that some of the side effects are things like fatigue, headache, muscle aches and pains, pain at the injection site. These are all considered to be pretty normal and relatively standard side effects that people can experience with a vaccine. These side effects are lasting, I would say, 2 days, even less on average, and they are, again, generally mild. For a frame of reference, there was one of these trials that enrolled about 100 patients, and I believe about 5 of them developed these types of side effects, so muscle aches and pains, mild fever.
Lynn says, since I'm on a disease-modifying therapy, am I at risk for getting an infection if someone else gets a vaccine for that infection?
Great question. So people living with MS, even those who are on an immunosuppressive disease-modifying therapy, would not be at risk of getting the infection from someone else close to them, like a family member, if that family member is getting a non-live vaccine. The flip side of that is live virus vaccines, and there's actually still debate in the MS community about what the risks to a person living with MS would be if their close family member, someone that they're exposed to, gets one of these live attenuated vaccines. So really this is a individualized, a personalized decision, and you should really be talking with your neurologist about how best to handle that type of situation.
Well, Dr. Ciotti, as you and I have been talking, I've had some wonderful help in the background. Julie Feel has been gathering questions while we've been otherwise occupied. So Julie, I'm hoping you'll pop up and join us. And hopefully you've got some additional questions that our viewers have been posting.
I don't know if my fingers have ever worked so quickly trying to keep up with all these questions that are coming in. So I'm going to just dive right in, Dr. Ciotti. We have a lot of people seeking some clarification around a topic you were discussing, and it was when you went through and listed out a lot of the different disease-modifying therapies and what those particular disease-modifying therapies might do to one's ability to mount a response to a vaccine or their ability to get sick from an infection that they have received a vaccination for in the past. So Victoria is asking if immune response is diminished with Ocrevus. Does that mean she's more likely to get a disease she's received a vaccination for in the past?
That's a difficult question to answer. The reason for that is that, frankly, there haven't been very many clinical trials looking into vaccine responses with Ocrevus. The trials that have been done, the studies that have looked into this, are really only detecting one particular type of immune response to vaccination. And that happens to be the type of immune response that Ocrevus impacts most directly. By targeting the B cells, we do limit those types of antibody responses to vaccines. And so there is a chance that a vaccine wouldn't be effective in somebody who's taking Ocrevus. That said, it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody would be more likely to contract an actual infection by receiving that vaccine, unless, with that big caveat, unless it's a live attenuated vaccine.
So Makaika is asking if the flu vaccine will work less because of the Ocrevus or not.
So it's possible, and that gets at, again, the way that Ocrevus works. Even though the influenza vaccine is inactivated, so should be safe for somebody who is on Ocrevus, we know that those types of immune responses are still limited or blunted in folks who are on Ocrevus. Again, you know, the data here is a little bit limited, and so we're doing a little bit of speculating just based on the way that Ocrevus works. But based on that, I do think that there's a chance that it would be less effective. Now, less effective doesn't necessarily mean not effective, but there is a chance that those immune responses could be decreased.
So Lindsay, and I'm sure many others who are watching with us today, are wanting to know, what would you suggest then for those using that drug?
So this is, again, you know, this gets back to personalized decision making. I think at the forefront of all of our minds, we certainly want to make sure that we are treating people living with MS appropriately, treating them effectively, and that always has to be kind of the primary consideration. You know, we have thought about, you know, perhaps in certain cases, dosing strategies could be changed. So rather than just doing an infusion once every 6 months, perhaps delaying those next infusions and then vaccinating when B cells are starting to come back, allowing the vaccine to generate the immune response, giving it a little bit of time, and then reinfusing the Ocrevus. These are things that have not been studied. And so this is, again, going to be a very individualized decision. Your neurologist, your MS specialist should really be, you know, starting to think about these sorts of things as we get closer to vaccine for SARS-CoV-2. But one answer is not going to fit all in this particular case.
So we have a viewer with us, Jess, who is newly diagnosed, and she's considering whether or not she should delay starting an immunosuppressant medication until after a COVID vaccine is available. Is it safe? She's asking, is it safe to be on an immunosuppressant like Ocrevus and get a vaccine like the one being created for COVID-19? So I guess there's really two things there. You know, if Jess was your patient, what would you advise her in terms of waiting to start a disease-modifying therapy? So we're getting at the timing again. And I guess just also to reiterate, what do we know about the safety of that type of vaccine?
So, you know, the answer there is that we just don't know much about, you know, the ultimate SARS-CoV-2 vaccine that's going to come out. But the ones that have advanced the furthest nowadays in the clinical trials are not live vaccines. They work in different ways. And so the safety of a vaccine, we presume, will be preserved. That should not be impacted by the disease-modifying therapy that you're on. I think the other side of the coin there is the effectiveness of the vaccine, like we talked about. You know, based on the way that some of these medicines work, you know, if they are immunosuppressive, they can limit some of the immune responses to a vaccine. As far as delaying the start of a medicine until we get one of these SARS-CoV-2 vaccines, that again is a very individualized decision that you would have to make in concert with your neurologist. One size, again, doesn't fit all in this situation. There are some folks where that may be appropriate, but it's certainly a question to ask. This does kind of lead into another point that I wanted to make here. We should always be making sure, for those who are already on a disease-modifying therapy, you shouldn't just stop it. Please don't stop your disease-modifying therapy in anticipation of one of these vaccines. Abruptly stopping one of these medicines can cause some pretty significant consequences from a MS standpoint. If it's something that you are considering or thinking about, certainly address this with your doctor before making any changes.
While we're on the subject of timing of vaccines and starting therapies, we had someone write in asking about switching therapy because of disease worsening. How much should the timing of the COVID-19 vaccine weigh into that decision?
I think here is depends a little bit on the reasons for switching. So if someone is switching because, you know, there's unfortunately progression of disease or new disease activity, so new relapses, new lesions developing on an MRI, Maybe that's not the type of case where we would think about just pausing on disease modifying therapy. We certainly want to make sure that we're getting things under control. As far as switching for other reasons, maybe de-escalating in the case of somebody who's been very stable for several years, that's certainly a consideration that could be made. Once again, though, these are all individualized decisions that depend on a lot of different factors. They're going to depend on demographics, things like age, other medical comorbidities. They're going to depend on, your level of disability, your MS subtype, maybe other features like the MRI or spinal fluid testing. So there's just a lot of different factors that all of us add into the equation when we talk about what medicine to start or which medicine to switch somebody to. And so I hesitate to get too specific there, just because it may not be applicable to everyone.
Well, just in what you've said, you've answered a lot of the questions that we've gotten. And a lot of people want to know about whether COVID-19 vaccine would be live or inactivated, which you alluded to. We're getting questions about getting vaccinated with 2 different vaccines at the same time. And is that safe? So for example, if someone is going to get the flu vaccine in the fall and they've not had a pneumonia vaccine and they're in the right age group and that's recommended, how safe is that?
So we do think that that's safe. We think that it's safe to get more than one vaccine at a time. Again, in terms of the actual SARS-CoV-2 vaccine, we won't have tested that specifically in conjunction with other vaccines, but it's certainly something to keep in mind and be aware of and take into consideration when we're getting those vaccines. I think that there are some countries that have planned studies to kind of confirm the safety of getting a COVID vaccine as well as an influenza vaccine at the same time. But those studies will take time. And again, there's a very good chance, I think, that we have more than one COVID-19 vaccine type. And so even the results of some of those studies may not be generalizable to everyone.
We're getting some questions, and I know you mentioned this earlier, but it's been a lot of information for us all to process. So I'm going to ask it again because I think it's important. What about people who are being treated with high-dose steroids for a relapse? Is it safe to be getting a vaccine like the flu vaccine or any other vaccine for that matter?
So the safety should be fine. So, we don't consider the steroids to really limit that, especially for vaccines that are inactivated. So things like the influenza vaccine, steroids shouldn't have an effect. But the doses of steroids that we use, as some are unfortunately probably aware, are extremely high, and we just don't have great data to guide us on the impact of those very high doses of steroids on immune responses to vaccines. For that reason, and again, because if you are dealing with some infection, whether that's COVID-19 or another, your immune system has bigger priorities in terms of responding to the current infection rather than preparing or training for another infection with a vaccine. And so generally, if you're on some of those high-dose steroids or if you're having a relapse, we generally recommend to just postpone the vaccination until that relapse has resolved.
Lots of questions coming in about the shingles vaccine. And I know the CDC is now recommending the Shingrix vaccine as the vaccine of choice. And so Karen and Cindy and many others, I've lost track of all of the names, are wondering, how safe is this and should they be getting it?
So everyone's asking really good questions. So the Shingrix vaccine is a little bit safer, and that's one of the reasons why the CDC is now recommending it. The Shingrix vaccine is inactivated, and so it shouldn't generate any sort of issues from that live virus perspective. This vaccine is particularly important because there are some MS disease modifying therapies that can lead to reactivation, that can predispose to these types of infections. And so some of the stronger immunosuppressants, sometimes clinicians will recommend that they get these vaccines ahead of time before starting, so that you have that immune memory and that it's robust and generated before your ability to respond to the vaccine is decreased.
So we just had Francie write in and ask if we could spell that vaccine name. So that's Shingrix.
Shingrix, that one is SHINGRIX. I don't come up with the names.
we can't get upset with you then for that one. We also are hearing somebody who wrote in, the questions are coming in so fast I'm losing track of the names, but somebody heard you mentioning the effect of fingolimod or Gilenya and perhaps lessening the effects of vaccines. It's Karen, and Karen is asking, nope, that's not Karen's question, but this person wants to know, should she be getting 2 flu vaccines? Would getting 2 flu vaccines add that extra protection that she's not getting because she's on a disease-modifying therapy?
What a fantastic question. I don't want to speculate or tell you the wrong thing because I actually don't know the answer to that. The influenza vaccine is generally just given once. And generally that's enough to stimulate the immune response. But we have talked about some of the medicines, as you mentioned, fingolimod or Gilenya, as well as siponimod or Mayzent, that may blunt those types of responses. One thing, there was a very interesting study looking at Mayzent where they tested the vaccine in a person who continued taking Mayzent, in someone who stopped taking Mayzent or just paused it for a little while around the time of vaccination. And comparing these 2 different groups, it looks like pausing the dosing actually led to a better immune response to the vaccine. That's certainly not something that I recommend that people go out and do on their own. Again, some of these medicines, and Mayzent specifically, can lead to a rebound of disease activity if it's stopped abruptly. But it's something that we are starting to take into consideration in terms of other strategies that we may be able to make here in helping assist that immune response to some of these vaccines. So that may be a strategy that your neurologist or MS specialist may be discussing with you.
That's such a good message, and thank you for reiterating the importance of not stopping your disease-modifying therapy without talking to your MS provider first. We are hearing from Karen. Last year, it sounds like she had the flu twice. This just doesn't seem fair, and she's saying, rightfully so, that she's afraid to get the flu vaccine this year. What do you suggest for her?
So Karen, I'm sorry to hear that. That's very unfortunate. Unfortunately, that can happen because the flu vaccine is really targeting the strains of influenza virus that are predicted to be most common in the community. There are others, and even with the influenza vaccine, it's certainly possible to become infected with influenza and possibly a couple of different strains of influenza over the course of a season. That said, the influenza infection, first and foremost, can cause some serious side effects, serious complications in people living with MS, regardless of what disease-modifying therapy that you're on. And so by getting this vaccine and helping lower your chance of that happening, it's just so important, and really important as we head into the next flu season, where we're going to be dealing not just with influenza, but also SARS-CoV-2. So let's try and remove the influenza as one more thing that we have to worry about, and at least lessen our chances of becoming infected.
Well, thank you so much. We got to, I think, almost all of our questions, and I'm going to throw it back over to John to wrap us up.
Thanks, Julie, and thanks to all of you who submitted your questions. And thank you again, Dr. Ciotti, for joining us today. I think that one of the best things that anyone can do for themselves, especially during these uncertain times, is to make sure that the information you're getting is credible and reliable. So we'd like to share some resources with you, and these are resources that you can really count on. I want to remind you that if we were unable to get to your question, please know that the National MS Society's MS Navigator team is available to answer your specific questions and connect you to the very best resources. I'll share all the ways that you can connect with an MS Navigator in just a moment. For more information on vaccinations and MS, you can visit the MS Society's website at nationalmssociety.org/vaccines. And if you'd like to review Dr. Ciotti's article on vaccinations and MS disease-modifying therapies, you're going to find it in the Multiple Sclerosis and Related Disorder Journal, and that's at msard-journal.com. And if you download the free Real Talk MS app from the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store, you'll actually get a copy of Dr. Ciotti's article under the bonus content tab this coming Tuesday when next week's Real Talk MS podcast episode is live. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're in the midst of an emotionally difficult time for so many people. And I want to make sure that you're aware that the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They offer free and confidential support for people in distress, as well as suicide prevention and crisis resources for you or your loved ones. You can reach them by calling 1-800-273-TALK. That's 1-800-273-8255. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, every week on the Real Talk MS podcast, I continue the conversation that we start here. So I hope you'll take a few minutes and give Real Talk MS a listen. You'll find the Real Talk MS podcast at realtalkms.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. And as I also mentioned a moment ago, if you have the free Real Talk MS app, you'll be receiving Dr. Ciotti's article as bonus content. And I think this article can be really helpful as we get into the flu season and as a COVID-19 vaccine is finally made available, or whenever you find yourself thinking about getting a vaccination or wondering what you should be thinking about. You'll have something to refer back to. You know, we're all witnessing that even during a pandemic, MS doesn't stop, and neither does the National MS Society. This webcast is just one example of how the MS Society has created virtual programming on the fly, so no one has to face MS alone. They've also created virtual support groups, provided resources and information about COVID-19 so that people affected by MS can get answers to their questions, and healthcare providers can deliver the very best care to their patients. The Society continues to amplify the voices of the MS movement to influence critical public policy decisions that are being made every day. And they never stop advancing the research that will find a cure. The National MS Society COVID-19 Response Fund has been established to ensure that the Society can meet the urgent and expanding needs of the MS community during these unprecedented times. And I'm asking you, as you're able, to support the MS Society's work by making a donation to the COVID-19 Response Fund. To donate, just text the word GIVE to 68686, and you'll get a link right to the MS Society's COVID-19 Response Fund webpage. I hope you'll contribute today because it's never been more important. I promise that we share all the ways for you to connect with an MS Navigator. You can find them on the MS Society's website at nationalmssociety.org, or you can contact an MS Navigator by phone at 1-800-344-4867, or you can email an MS Navigator at contactusnmss@nmss.org. You can also connect with the National MS Society on your favorite social media channels, including Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And when you do, don't forget to like those posts, subscribe to those channels, and you want to make sure that you get on the Society's mailing list by signing up at their website. That way, you'll receive regular updates on upcoming programs and the latest information on MS treatments, research, and how to live the very best life with MS. I'd like to thank Dr. John Ciotti for joining us today, and I'd like to thank everyone who's joined us for your really great questions. Please remember that a recording of this webinar is going to be available for your review on the Society's website, at nationalmssociety.org/msexpert. And now I have a favor to ask each of you. Your feedback is really important. So you're going to see a survey pop up in a moment when we close out the webinar. And if you happen to be watching on Facebook Live, you'll see a link to that survey pinned to the comments section. And on YouTube, you'll find that link in the program description. Completing the survey makes a real difference. The information you provide helps us to continuously improve, and it helps shape future programs. The survey only takes 1 minute, so please take a minute to fill it out. On behalf of Dr. John Ciotti and the National MS Society, I want to thank you once again for joining us. Please stay safe and make healthy choices.